The medical bay at Nexus 7 was unusually quiet in the days following the arena fight. Jake sat beside Vextar's recovery bed, helping the chief instructor with the mobility exercises that the doctors had prescribed for his damaged spine. The irony was not lost on either of them that the human who had caused the injury was now assisting with the healing process. "Range of motion is improving," Jake observed as Vexatar slowly moved his arms through the prescribed patterns. "The doctors say you should have full function back within a few weeks." Vextar completed the exercise and leaned back against his medical bed. The powered exoskeleton that helped support his injured spine made soft mechanical noises as it adjusted to his movement. "I have been thinking about our fight." "What about it?" Jake asked, checking the readings on the medical monitors. "I have trained warriors from over 100 different species during my career at Nexus 7, Vexatar said slowly. "I have seen every possible combination of strength, speed, natural weapons, and tactical thinking. But I have never encountered anything like what you demonstrated in that arena." Jake shrugged. "I just fought the way humans fight. Nothing special about it." "That is where you are wrong," Vexatar replied, his voice carrying a weight that Jake had not heard before. "What you demonstrated was not just different tactics or techniques. It was a completely different philosophy of warfare. Over the past week, Jake had noticed changes throughout the station. Other recruits looked at him with a mixture of respect and curiosity that had not been there before. Instructors from different departments had begun asking him questions about human military history and tactics. Even the maintenance staff seemed more interested in talking with him. Gary had summed it up best during one of his visits to the medical bay. "Word is spreading beyond Nexus 7. There are military commanders throughout the galaxy who want to know more about the human who defeated a Krillian chief instructor in formal combat. Some of them are scared. Others are fascinated. All of them are paying attention, but the most significant change had been in Vextar himself. The proud Krillian warrior had spent decades believing that strength and aggression were the ultimate measures of military capability. Jake's victory had forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about warfare. "I want to continue as your primary instructor," Vextar announced suddenly. Jake looked up from the medical chart he had been reading. "What do you mean?" "The program director has offered to assign you to a different instructor for the remainder of your training," Vextar explained. "Standard procedure after a formal combat challenge, but I have requested to remain as your trainer." "Why?" Jake asked. Vextar was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling of the medical bay. "Because I have realized that I have been teaching warfare incorrectly for most of my career. I have been preparing warriors to fight the way their species naturally fight, rather than teaching them to think beyond their natural limitations." Jake understood what the alien was saying. "You want to learn human tactics. I want to learn why humans refuse to accept defeat even when defeat seems inevitable," Vextar corrected. "I want to understand how your species developed the ability to turn disadvantages into advantages, and I want to incorporate those lessons into the training program." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Kim Martinez, the chief medical officer for Nexus 7. She was one of only 3 humans on the station, and she had been monitoring both Jake's and Vextar's recovery from the arena fight. "How are we feeling today?" Dr. Martinez asked, checking the readings on Vexatar's medical equipment. "Functional," Vexatar replied. "When will I be cleared for full duty?" "Another week, possibly 2 if you want to avoid permanent damage," Dr. Martinez said. "Your spine is healing well, but Krillian bone structure is different from human anatomy. I want to be careful After the doctor left, Jake helped Vextar with the rest of his physical therapy routine. The exercises were designed to rebuild strength and flexibility in the damaged area, and Jake had volunteered to assist despite having his own injuries to recover from. "There is something else," Vexitar said as they finished the session. "I have been analyzing recordings of our fight, trying to understand exactly how you were able to defeat me." "And what did you find?" Jake asked. "You never fought to win," Vextar said. "You fought to survive long enough for me to make a mistake. That is a completely different approach to combat than anything I have encountered before." Jake nodded. "Human military doctrine teaches that you should never fight a battle you can win quickly and decisively. But if you have to fight a battle, you cannot win. The goal is to make it as expensive as possible for your opponent while looking for opportunities to change the situation." "Expensive how?" "Time, energy, resources, morale," Jake explained. "In our fight, I knew I could not match your strength or natural weapons. So I made you work harder than you expected, forced you to use more energy than you planned, and waited for frustration to cloud your judgment." Vextar was quiet for several minutes processing this information. "Your species approaches warfare as a long-term strategic problem rather than a series of tactical encounters." "Exactly," Jake said. "Humans learned to think several moves ahead because we had to. We were never the strongest or fastest predators on our world, so we had to be smarter." 3 weeks later, Jake stood in the graduation ceremony hall alongside the 17 other recruits who had survived the complete Voidwalker training program. From an original class of 50 beings, they represented the elite survivors of 6 months of systematic torture designed to forge the galaxy's most capable Special Forces operatives. The ceremony was attended by military commanders from across the galaxy, many of whom had come specifically to see the human who had defeated Chief Instructor Vextar. Jake could feel their attention like a physical weight, but he focused on the significance of the moment rather than the politics surrounding it. Vextar, wearing his powered exoskeleton but moving with increasing confidence, personally awarded each graduate their Voidwalker certification. When he reached Jake, the chief instructor paused and spoke loudly enough for the entire hall to hear. "Recruit Jake Murphy," Vexitar announced. "You have completed the Voidwalker program with distinction, but more importantly, you have taught me what it truly means to be unbreakable." As Vextar handed Jake his certification, the alien leaned closer and spoke quietly. "I have trained 10,000 warriors from 100 worlds, but today I learned something about strength that I had never understood before." "What is that?" Jake whispered back. "True strength is not about avoiding defeat," Vextar replied. "True strength is about getting back up every time you're knocked down, no matter how many times it happens." After the ceremony, as Jake prepared to receive his first assignment with the Galactic Special Forces, he found Vextar waiting for him outside the graduation hall. The chief instructor was leaning heavily on his mobility support, but his expression was one of determination rather than pain. "I have a request," Vextar said. "What kind of request?" "I want you to help me redesign the Voidwalker training program," Vextar explained. "I want to incorporate human concepts of adaptability and endurance into the curriculum. I want to teach other species what you have taught me." Jake looked at his former tormentor, now asking for his help in training the next generation of galactic warriors. "What makes you think other species can learn to fight like humans?" "Because," Vextar said, "you have proven that strength comes in many forms. Physical power is only one type of strength. Mental toughness, emotional resilience, strategic thinking, and the ability to work as part of a team are equally important. Jake thought about the offer while watching other graduates saying goodbye to their instructors and preparing for their new assignments. He had originally come to Nexus 7 to prove that humans deserved a place among the galaxy's elite warriors. But somewhere along the way, the mission had become more complicated. "I accept," Jake said finally, "but I have one condition." "What condition?" "We train them to fight like humans when necessary, but we also teach them to fight like themselves when that is more effective," Jake explained. "The goal is not to make every species fight exactly like humans. The goal is to teach them to recognize when they need to adapt their natural fighting style to overcome superior opponents." Vexitar smiled, an expression that still looked somewhat frightening on his scarred features. "Agreed. We will teach them that sometimes the best way to honor your species is to fight like a different species entirely." As Jake walked away from Nexus 7 to begin his career as a Void Walker, he carried with him not just his certification and his new assignment, but also the knowledge that he had fundamentally changed how the galaxy thought about warfare and strength. Human who had arrived with a broken nose was leaving as a teacher, carrying the weight of responsibility for training the next generation of warriors. And for the first time since leaving Earth, Jake felt like he truly understood what it meant to represent humanity among the stars. Behind him, Vexitar watched the human disappear into the transport bay, knowing that he would never again underestimate the species that had learned to turn their greatest weaknesses into their most devastating strengths. The main arena at Nexus 7 had never hosted a formal combat challenge between an instructor and a recruit. Word of the fight had spread throughout the entire station, and beings from every department had gathered to watch what most expected to be an execution disguised as a sporting event. Jake stood in the preparation area, checking his gear and trying to ignore the growing crowd noise from beyond the arena doors. He had been offered armor and weapons by several well-meaning friends, but the rules of formal combat were clear. No equipment except what both fighters agreed upon, and Vexitar had chosen to fight with natural weapons only. Gary had arrived an hour earlier with what he claimed was helpful advice. "You know, it's not too late to apologize and back down. Formal combat challenges can be withdrawn if both parties agree." "Not happening," Jake replied, finishing his warm-up stretches. His body was still recovering from weeks of brutal training, but he felt as ready as he would ever be. "Vexitar has killed beings in formal combat before," Gary continued desperately. "Big, dangerous beings with natural armor and weapons. You are just a human." Jake looked at his friend and smiled. "That is exactly the point." The arena doors opened, with a grinding sound that echoed through the preparation area. Jake walked out into the circular fighting space and was immediately struck by how many beings had come to watch. The viewing areas were packed with representatives from every species on the station. He spotted other instructors, maintenance, crews, medical staff, and even some beings he had never seen before. In the center of the arena floor, Chief Instructor Vexitar waited with his arms crossed over his massive chest. The Krillian looked even larger and more dangerous than usual, his scarred hide gleaming under the bright arena lights. His claws had been sharpened to razor points, and his black eyes held the cold focus of a professional killer. The arena master, a floating mechanical device, announced the rules in its synthetic voice. "Formal combat between Chief Instructor Vexitar and Recruit Jake Murphy. Combat continues until one fighter yields, becomes unconscious, or dies. Medical intervention is prohibited unless both fighters become incapacitated. Begin when ready. Jake." walked to the center of the arena and took a fighting stance he had learned years ago in a dirty gym on Earth. Vextar studied him for a moment, then nodded with what might have been approval. "You are either very brave or very stupid, human," Vextar said. "Probably both," Jake replied. The fight began without ceremony. Vextar moved with the fluid speed of a trained killer, his opening attack designed to end the fight immediately. His massive fist, backed by 7 feet of muscle and bone, shot toward Jake's head with enough force to shatter concrete. Jake was not there when the punch arrived. Human reflexes were not as fast as most alien species, but Jake had spent weeks studying Vexitar's fighting style. The chief instructor was incredibly dangerous, but he was also predictable. Krillians fought the way their species had always fought, with overwhelming force and direct aggression. Jake slipped the punch by inches and moved to Vextar's side, looking for an opening. The Krillian's armor was thickest on his chest and back, but there were gaps at the joints where flexibility was more important than protection. Vexitar spun with surprising speed, his other hand sweeping toward Jake in a backhand that would have taken his head off. Jake ducked under the blow and drove his elbow toward Vextar's kidney area, hoping to hit a nerve cluster he had identified during their previous encounters. The blow connected, but Vextar's natural armor turned aside most of the impact. The chief instructor grunted and pivoted, bringing his knee up toward Jake's ribs with bone-crushing force. Jake caught the knee on his forearms and used Vextar's own momentum to throw the massive alien off balance. It was a technique he had learned in martial arts training, using an opponent's strength and weight against them. For a moment, Vexitar staggered, and Jake saw his chance. He stepped inside the Krillian's guard and delivered a series of quick strikes to vulnerable points on Vextar's neck and throat, and the attacks were precise and calculated, designed to disrupt nerve function rather than cause massive damage. Vextar recovered quickly and grabbed Jake by the throat with one massive hand. The alien's grip was like a steel vise, cutting off Jake's air supply and lifting him off the ground. Jake could hear the crowd noise changing as spectators realized that the fight was about to end. But Jake had been prepared for this. He wrapped both hands around Vexitar's wrist and used his legs to kick against the alien's chest, applying pressure in a direction that no natural joint was designed to handle. It was a leverage technique that could break bones if applied correctly. Vextar released his grip and stepped back, shaking his injured wrist. For the first time since the fight began, the chief instructor looked genuinely surprised. "Impossible," Vextar muttered. "No being your size should be able to break that hold." Jake landed on his feet and immediately moved back into fighting position. Physics does not care about size. Leverage is leverage. The fight continued with neither fighter able to gain a decisive advantage. Vexitar was stronger, faster, and better armed, but Jake was proving to be more adaptable and unpredictable. Every time the Krillian tried to use his natural advantages, Jake found a way to turn those advantages against him. But the human was taking damage. Vexitar's attacks were too powerful to completely avoid, and Jake's protective gear was not designed to handle this level of punishment. Blood was streaming from cuts on his face and arms, and his ribs ached from several near misses that had still managed to cause bruising. The turning point came when Vextar, frustrated by his inability to end the fight quickly, made a mistake that Jake had been waiting for. The chief instructor charged forward with both claws extended, intending to overwhelm Jake with pure aggression. Jake waited until the last possible second, then dropped to the ground and rolled between Vextar's legs. As the massive alien's momentum carried him forward. Jake kicked upward with both feet, striking Vexatar in the lower back with every ounce of strength he could manage. The impact sent Vexatar stumbling toward the arena wall with enough force to crack his exoskeleton. The chief instructor hit the reinforced barrier with a sound like breaking stone and collapsed to his knees. Jake rolled to his feet and moved away from his opponent, breathing hard and trying to assess the damage he had caused. Vexatar was struggling to stand, his movements showing clear signs of injury. "Yield!" Jake called out, loud enough for the entire arena to hear. "You have fought with honor. There is no shame in ending this now." Vexatar managed to stand and turn around, but Jake could see that the alien's spine had been damaged. The chief instructor was moving with obvious pain and difficulty. "I do not yield to prey animals," Vexatar snarled, but his voice lacked its usual strength. "Then you are about to learn why humans became the dominant species on their world," Jake replied calmly. Vexatar charged again, but his injured spine affected his balance and coordination. Jake sidestepped the attack easily and struck the Krillian's damaged back with a precise blow that sent the alien crashing to the arena floor. This time, Vexatar did not get up immediately. The chief instructor lay on his side, his breathing labored, and his movements weak. Jake approached carefully, ready to defend himself if necessary, but it was clear that the fight was over. "The problem with your species," Jake said, kneeling beside his fallen opponent, "is that you mistake brutality for strength. You never learned the most important human lesson. It is not about how hard you can hit. It is about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward." Vexatar looked up at Jake with an expression that the human had never seen before. It might have been respect, or it might have been something else entirely. "How?" Vexatar asked weakly. Jake thought about the question, while medical teams finally entered the arena to treat both fighters. Around them, the crowd was completely silent, as if no one could quite believe what they had just witnessed. Humans spent thousands of years learning how to kill things that were bigger and stronger than we were, Jake explained. "We had to, because everything else on our world was trying to kill us. We learned to use our brains instead of our muscles, to work together instead of fighting alone, and to never give up no matter how bad things looked." As the medical teams worked on Vexatar's injured spine, Jake stood up and looked around the arena. Every eye was focused on him, and he could see a mixture of fear, respect, and curiosity in those alien faces. For the first time since arriving at Nexus 7, Jake felt like he had truly represented his species. He had shown them what humans were capable of when they stopped trying to fight like other species and started fighting like humans. The arena master's mechanical voice echoed through the suddenly quiet space. "Winner by incapacitation. Recruit Jake Murphy." The 6th week of training brought live fire exercises in the station's maze sectors, a deadly network of corridors and chambers designed to simulate real combat conditions. Jake moved through the artificial smoke and flashing lights, his assigned, weapon ready, and his mind focused on the mission objectives. His squad consisted of himself, a Krillian warrior named Thek, and an ethereal called Wisp, who could phase through solid matter when necessary. They had been tasked with reaching a specific location in the maze while avoiding or neutralizing hostile targets operated by the station's artificial intelligence. Jake had learned to work with alien squad mates over the past weeks. Each species brought different strengths and weaknesses to combat situations. Thek was incredibly strong and nearly indestructible, but he tended to charge straight at problems without thinking. Wisp was excellent for reconnaissance and could pass through walls, but physical combat was difficult when you were made of gas and energy. Target zone is 300 meters northeast. Jake whispered into his communication device. Wisp, can you scout ahead and report on defensive positions? The ethereal's form shimmered and became translucent. Moving now, human Jake. Will report in 60 seconds. Thek hefted his massive weapon, which would have required 2 humans to carry. Why do we need scouting? We should attack directly and overwhelm any resistance. Because that is exactly what they expect us to do, Jake replied. The maze is designed to punish predictable tactics. Over the weeks, Jake had noticed that most alien species approached problems in ways that reflected their natural advantages. Krillians relied on strength and aggression. Avirans used speed and aerial tactics. Granite folk simply absorbed damage until their enemies exhausted themselves. But humans had learned to be unpredictable because they could not rely on any single natural advantage. Wisp's voice crackled through the communication system. 4 automated defense turrets covering the main approach. Alternative route through maintenance tunnels. But they are heavily trapped. Enemy squad of 3 targets holding secondary position. Jake studied the tactical display on his wrist device. The direct approach would be suicide, and the maintenance tunnels were obviously designed to channel attackers into kill zones. But there was a third option that required thinking like a human rather than like a traditional warrior. New plan, Jake announced. Thek, I need you to create a distraction at the main entrance. Make as much noise as possible and keep their attention focused on you. Wisp, use the maintenance tunnels, but do not try to avoid the traps. I want you to trigger them deliberately to create confusion. What will you do? Thek asked. Something they will not expect, Jake replied. 20 minutes later, Jake was crawling through an air circulation vent that was barely large enough for his human frame. While Thek created chaos at the main entrance and Wisp triggered every trap in the maintenance system, Jake had found a third route that none of the maze designers had considered important enough to defend heavily. The plan worked perfectly until Jake reached the target zone and found something that made his blood turn cold. Wisp was lying motionless on the floor, his gaseous form flickering weakly. The ethereal had been caught in crossfire from another squad and was badly injured. Jake immediately broke from his concealed position and moved to help his squad mate, ignoring the mission objectives and the automated weapons that were beginning to track his movement. In human military doctrine, you never left a wounded comrade behind, even if it meant failing the mission. Wisp, can you hear me? Jake asked, kneeling beside the injured ethereal and trying to figure out how to provide medical aid to a being made of gas and energy. Human Jake, Wisp whispered, his voice barely audible. Mission objectives must be completed. Leave me and continue. Not happening, Jake replied firmly. He activated his emergency beacon to call for medical support, then began laying down covering fire to keep the automated defenses away from their position. That was when Vextar arrived. The chief instructor appeared in the target zone like a nightmare made real, his massive form moving with deadly purpose. But instead of helping with the medical emergency, he grabbed Jake by the back of his combat vest and lifted him off the ground. What do you think you are doing, human? Vextar demanded, his voice full of rage. Providing aid to a wounded squad. Mate, Jake replied, struggling in the Krillian's grip. You abandoned your mission objectives to help a being who is already dying, Vextar snarled. This is weakness. This is why your species will never be true warriors. Jake felt something, cold and angry, settling in his chest. Put me down! You will return to your mission immediately, or you will be eliminated from the program, Vextar continued, apparently not hearing Jake's request. Voidwalkers do not risk mission failure for sentiment. I said put me down, Jake repeated, his voice getting quieter instead of louder. Vextar finally seemed to notice Jake's tone. The chief instructor set him down but remained looming over him, radiating menace and authority. Around them, other squads and instructors had stopped their exercises to watch the confrontation. You think your human compassion makes you superior to warrior species? Vextar said, his voice carrying across the training area. You think your weakness is actually strength, but when the real fighting begins, your enemies will not care about your wounded. They will kill you while you waste time on the dying. Jake looked down at Wisp, who was still conscious but clearly in serious condition. Then he looked up at Vextar, and for the first time since arriving at Nexus 7, he stopped trying to be respectful. You know what the real difference is between humans and every other species in this galaxy? Jake asked, his voice calm and steady. We do not just adapt to survive, we adapt to win. The training area became completely silent. Jake could see other instructors moving closer, probably expecting violence to break out at any moment. Theka had arrived and was staring at the confrontation with obvious concern. Vexatar's expression shifted from anger to something that might have been curiosity. Explain. Every species here fights the way their nature tells them to fight, Jake said, gesturing around the training area. Krillians use strength and aggression because that is what worked on your homeworld. Avarans use speed and aerial tactics because that is how they evolved. But humans had to learn to fight everything that was bigger, stronger, faster, and better armed than we were. Jake stepped closer to Vexatar, completely ignoring the size difference between them. We learned to use tools, to work together, to think our way around problems that could not be solved with natural weapons. And most importantly, we learned that taking care of each other makes us stronger, not weaker. Sentiment, Vextar dismissed. Your species confuses emotional attachment with tactical advantage. No, Jake replied, and for the first time since meeting the chief instructor, he smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. We learned that a warrior who knows his comrades will never abandon him will fight twice as hard as a warrior who fights only for himself. We learned that mercy and compassion are force multipliers, not weaknesses. Vextar was staring at Jake with an expression that the human could not quite read. You dare to lecture me about warfare? You, whose species has barely left its home system? I dare to tell you that your understanding of warfare is incomplete, Jake said calmly, and I am ready to prove it. The challenge hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Jake could hear other beings around the training area talking quietly among themselves. Some were probably taking bets on how quickly Vextar would kill him. Formal combat, Vexatar announced suddenly. Tomorrow at mid-cycle in the main arena. Full contact until one of us can no longer continue. Jake nodded without hesitation. Accepted. As medical teams arrived to treat Wisp and the training exercise officially ended, Jake found himself surrounded by other recruits and instructors who wanted to know if he had completely lost his mind. The consensus seemed to be that challenging. Vextar to formal combat was essentially an elaborate form of suicide, but Jake was not thinking about the fight tomorrow. He was thinking about something his old drill sergeant had told him during his first week of basic training on Earth. The thing about humans, the sergeant had said, is that we are really, really good at killing things that are bigger than us. We have been doing it for thousands of years. Size is not always an advantage when your opponent is smart enough to turn your strength against you. That night, as Jake lay in his bunk preparing for what might be his last day alive, he thought, about all the ways humans had learned to defeat superior opponents throughout their history. David and Goliath was not just a story, it was a blueprint. Tomorrow, he would show Vextar and everyone else on Nexus 7 what humans had learned during their long climb to the top of Earth's food chain. Tomorrow, he would prove that being the apex predator was not about having the biggest claws or the strongest bite. It was about being smart enough, stubborn enough, and mean enough to keep fighting until you found a way to win. 3 weeks had passed since Jake's first day at Nexus 7, and his nose still ached when the artificial weather systems changed pressure. The medical bay had offered to fix it properly, but Jake had refused. He wanted to remember that first lesson from Vextar. The training schedule was brutal beyond anything Jake had experienced in Earth's military. Each day began at what the station called 0400 hours. Though time meant little in the eternal darkness of space, Jake would wake up on his narrow bunk, already sore from the previous day's punishment, and prepare for another 16 hours of systematic torture. Breakfast was a gray paste that supposedly contained all necessary nutrients. Jake had learned not to ask what those nutrients came from. He sat with the other surviving recruits, their numbers already reduced from 50 to 31. The eliminations had not all been voluntary. "Morning, nosebreaker," said Gary Liu, one of the few humans Jake had met during his time on the station. Gary worked in the maintenance section and had been on Nexus 7 for 2 years. "How many more recruits dropped out yesterday?" "2, Jake replied, spooning the gray paste into his mouth. "1 granite folk and one of those cat things from Felinar." "Felinar. Warriors are supposed to be some of the toughest in the galaxy," Gary said, shaking his head. "What happened?" Vextar broke the cat thing's spirit during pain tolerance training. The granite folk just walked away during the zero-gravity combat exercise. Said he had seen enough. Gary nodded knowingly. "Vextar has been watching you extra close lately. Word around the station is that he's never had a recruit challenge him the way you did on assessment day." Jake finished his breakfast and checked the training schedule on his wrist device. Today would be environmental adaptation training, which meant 6 hours in conditions designed to kill most known life forms. After that, weapons training with live ammunition, followed by tactical planning exercises that would last until the artificial lights dimmed for night cycle. "I need to go," Jake said, standing up from the table. "Environmental training starts in 10 minutes. "Try not to die," Gary called after him. "You're the most interesting thing that's happened here in months. The environmental training chamber could simulate the conditions of any known world in the galaxy." Today's lesson would cover combat in high radiation zones. Jake joined the other recruits outside the chamber, noting that their ranks had been reduced again. A Serpentian named Slicks had been eliminated during yesterday's endurance run after collapsing from exhaustion. Vextar arrived precisely on time, as always. The chief instructor never showed any sign of fatigue or weakness, despite running the same exercises alongside his recruits. His scarred hide seemed immune to radiation, extreme temperatures, and toxic atmospheres. "Today you will learn to fight while your bodies are slowly being destroyed by radiation," Vextar announced. "The chamber is set to simulate the conditions on Zerion Prime, where the Void Walkers fought their most famous campaign. Radiation levels will increase every 30 minutes. When you can no longer continue, you will signal for extraction. The eye." Recruits filed into the chamber wearing basic protective gear that would reduce but not eliminate their radiation exposure. Jake felt the familiar tingle in his skin that meant the invisible death was already working on his cells. The first 30 minutes were almost easy. The radiation levels were uncomfortable, but manageable, and the combat exercises were straightforward. Jake sparred with a massive Ursoid named Gron, who fought with the brutal efficiency of his species. Jake was smaller and weaker, but his human. Reflexes and pattern recognition allowed him to avoid the worst of Gron's attacks. When the radiation levels increased for the second time, things became more difficult. Jake could feel his skin beginning to burn, and his stomach was starting to rebel against the gray breakfast paste. Around him, other recruits were showing similar signs of distress. By the third increase, 2 more recruits had signaled for extraction. A bird like Averin had collapsed during weapons practice, and one of the ethereals had simply announced that he refused to continue and floated toward the exit portal. Jake was beginning to feel seriously ill. His vision was blurry, his hands shook when he tried to hold weapons, and he could taste blood in his mouth. But he noticed something interesting about Vexitar. The chief instructor was showing signs of stress for the first time since Jake had met him. The Krillion's movements were slightly less fluid, and he was breathing harder than usual. Humans, adapt, Jake muttered to himself, remembering something his drill sergeant had told him years ago on Earth. We might not be the strongest or the fastest, but we adapt to anything. The fourth radiation increase brought the levels to what the chamber called immediately lethal to most carbon-based life forms. Jake watched 3 more recruits signal for extraction, including Gron, who had seemed indestructible during their sparring sessions. Only 8 recruits remained in the chamber, and Jake was surprised to find that he was feeling slightly better than he had 30 minutes ago. His nausea was still present, but manageable. His vision had cleared, and his hands were steady again. Vexitar was staring at him with something that might have been interest, or might have been anger. "How are you feeling, human?" "Like I have been better," Jake replied honestly. "But I can continue." "Interesting," Vexitar said. "Your species has no natural radiation resistance. According to my files, humans should have been eliminated by the second increase." Jake shrugged. "Maybe your files are incomplete. The 5th increase reduced their number to 4 recruits." Jake was now sharing the chamber with a Krillian who seemed related to Vexitar, an ethereal who had somehow maintained coherent form despite the radiation, and something that looked like a walking crystal formation. Jake was definitely suffering now. His skin felt like it was on fire, and every breath was an effort. But he had experienced worse during survival training in Earth's most hostile environments. Humans had lived through ice ages, plagues, and nuclear wars. A little radiation was just another obstacle to overcome. The 6th increase eliminated the crystal being and the ethereal. Only Jake and the other Krillian remained. Vexitar was watching both of them with intense focus, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "This is highly irregular," Vexitar announced. "No recruit has ever survived beyond the 5th increase except for members of naturally radiation-resistant species." The other Krillian, whose name was apparently Crix, was visibly struggling. His armored hide was changing color, and his breathing was labored. Jake was in no better condition, but he had learned long ago to push through pain and discomfort. "Ready for increase 7? Vexitar asked. Crix immediately signaled for extraction, leaving Jake alone in the chamber with radiation levels that should have killed him several times over. Vexitar studied the readings on his equipment, then looked at Jake with something approaching respect. "How?" Vexitar asked simply. Jake thought about the question seriously. He was barely standing. His body was screaming in protest, and he could feel the radiation doing permanent damage to his cells. But he was still functional, still able to think and move and fight if necessary. Humans do not have natural armor, like Krillians, Jake said slowly. We do not have natural weapons like most species. We do not even have particularly good reflexes or strength. But we have something else. What? Vextar demanded. We refuse to quit, Jake said. No matter how bad things get, no matter how much pain we are in, no matter how impossible the situation looks, humans just keep going. It is what we do. Vextar was quiet for a long moment. Signal for extraction, human. You have proven your point. Jake nodded and triggered the extraction signal. As the radiation levels began to decrease and medical teams entered the chamber, he noticed that Vexitar was still watching him with that same calculating look. Later, as Jake lay in the medical bay receiving treatment for radiation poisoning, Gary stopped by to visit. Heard you lasted through 7 increases, Gary said, settling into a chair beside Jake's bed. That's some kind of record. It does not feel like a victory, Jake replied. His skin was raw and painful, and the medical scanners showed cellular damage that would take weeks to heal. Maybe not, Gary said. But word is spreading through the station. Beings are starting to talk about the human who would not quit. Some of them are scared. Jake closed his eyes and tried to rest. He had a feeling that Vexitar's interest in him was far from over, and tomorrow would bring new tests and new ways to measure his breaking point. But Jake was beginning to understand something important about himself and his species. Humans might not be the strongest or the fastest, but they had evolved on a world that tried to kill them every single day. They had learned to endure, to adapt, and to keep fighting when every rational instinct told them to give up. Tomorrow, Vextar would try to break him again, and Jake would be ready. Jake Murphy pressed his face against the transport window and watched the massive space station grow larger with each passing second. Nexus 7 looked like a metal city floating in the darkness of space, with bright lights marking docking bays and training areas. The station was home to the galaxy's most feared military program, and Jake was about to become the first human ever accepted into it. The transport pilot, a blue-skinned alien with 4 arms, glanced back at Jake through the mirror. You sure about this, human? Most beings who go to Nexus 7 don't come back the same way they went in. Jake adjusted his military uniform and checked his gear one more time. I'm sure. The pilot shook his head and focused on the docking procedures. Jake had heard the warnings before. The Voidwalker program had a 90% failure rate. Most beings who tried to complete the training either quit or were carried out on medical stretchers. But Jake had not come this far to turn back now. The docking bay was enormous, filled with ships from dozens of different worlds. Jake saw sleek vessels from the bird-like Avarins, heavy transport ships from the rock people called Granite Folk, and strange floating pods used by the gas beings known as ethereals. Each ship represented a different species, a different way of fighting, and a different reason to be here. Jake grabbed his single bag and stepped off the transport. The artificial gravity felt heavier than Earth normal, and the air had a metallic taste that made his nose itch. Around him, beings of all shapes and sizes moved through the docking bay with purpose. Some walked on 2 legs like humans, others crawled on 6 or 8 limbs, and a few simply floated through the air. A mechanical voice echoed through the bay. All new recruits report to Processing Center 7 immediately. Failure to comply will result in immediate expulsion from the program. Jake followed the signs through a maze of corridors. The walls were made of some kind of metal that seemed to absorb light, making everything look darker than it should. Emergency lights cast red shadows that reminded Jake of blood. He wondered if that was intentional. The processing center was a large room filled with benches and tables. About 50 beings sat waiting, each looking dangerous in their own way. Jake recognized some of the species from his briefings. The 7-foot-tall Krillians with their armored skin and razor-sharp claws. The snake-like Serpentians who could move faster than the eye could follow. The massive Ursoids who looked like walking bears made of muscle and teeth. Jake found an empty spot on a bench between a Krillian and something that looked like a walking tree. The Krillian turned to look at him, its black eyes studying Jake like he was an interesting insect. "What are you supposed to be?" the Krillian asked in a voice that sounded like gravel being crushed. "Human," Jake replied. The Krillian made a sound that might have been laughter. "I have never heard of humans in the war colleges. What makes your species think they can become void walkers?" "I guess we will find out," Jake said. More beings filed into the room over the next hour. Jake counted 12 different species, though he was sure there were more he could not identify. Some looked almost human, while others were so alien that Jake had trouble figuring out which end was the head. The room fell silent when the instructors entered. Jake had read about Krillians, but seeing them in person was different. Chief Instructor Vextar was the largest, standing nearly 8 feet tall with scars covering his armored hide. His claws were stained dark, and his eyes held the cold look of someone who had killed many times and would kill again without hesitation. "Welcome to Nexus 7, Vextar announced, his voice carrying easily through the large room. "I am Chief Instructor Vextar, and for the next 6 months, your life belongs to me. Some of you think you are warriors because you won fights on your home worlds. You are wrong. You are nothing but raw material, and most of you are not even good raw material." Vextar began walking through the room, stopping to examine each recruit. When he reached Jake, the massive Krillian paused and tilted his head. "Human," Vextar said, making the word sound like a curse. "I have studied your species. Weak bones, thin skin, slow reflexes, poor natural weapons. Tell me, human, why should I waste time training something that nature clearly designed to be prey?" Jake stood up slowly. Even standing, the top of his head barely reached Vextar's chest. "Maybe being prey taught us things that predators never learned." The room became deadly quiet. Several recruits moved away from Jake, as if expecting violence to break out at any moment. Vextar stared down at Jake for a long moment, then smiled, showing rows of sharp teeth. "Interesting answer," Vextar said. "We will test this theory very soon." The chief instructor continued his inspection, but Jake could feel the alien's attention returning to him again and again. When Vextar finished his walk through the room, he returned to the front. "Training begins now," Vextar announced. "Follow me to Assessment Area 1. We will see what each of you is worth." The assessment area was a large circular room with padded floors and walls. Weapons of various types hung on racks around the edges. In the center of the room was a raised platform surrounded by viewing areas. "Assessment is simple," Vextar explained. "Each recruit will face me in combat. I will determine your skill level, your pain tolerance, and your will to continue. Some of you will be eliminated today. Others will wish they had been." The first recruit was a Serpentian who moved like liquid lightning. Vextar defeated him in less than 30 seconds. Using the alien's own speed against him. The second was an Ursoid who looked like he could tear apart a tank with his bare hands. Vextar broke his arm and threw him out of the ring. One by one, recruits faced the chief instructor. Some lasted longer than others, but none came close to winning. Jake watched carefully, studying Vextar's fighting style and looking for weaknesses. The Krillian was incredibly strong and fast, but he seemed to rely on intimidation as much as skill. "Human," Vextar called when only a few recruits remained. "Your turn." Jake stepped onto the platform. Up close, Vextar looked even more massive and dangerous. The alien's claws could probably cut through Jake's bones like paper, and his armored hide would turn away any normal human weapon. "No weapons," Vexatar said. "This is about natural ability." Jake nodded and raised his hands in a basic fighting stance. Vexatar studied him for a moment, then moved faster than Jake thought possible. The Krillian's first punch caught Jake in the stomach, lifting him off his feet and sending him flying across the platform. Jake hit the padding hard enough to see stars, but he forced himself to roll and get back to his feet. Vextar was already moving again, his massive fist aimed at Jake's head. Jake ducked under the punch and tried to move away, but Vextar's other hand caught him across the face. The sound of Jake's nose breaking was loud enough to echo through the assessment area. Blood streamed down his face as he staggered backward, his vision blurry from the pain. Around the room, other recruits watched in silence. Jake wiped the blood from his face with the back of his hand, then reached up and pushed his broken nose back into place with a wet grinding sound. The pain was incredible, but he had experienced worse during his military training on Earth. "Is that all you have got?" Jake asked, settling back into his fighting stance. For the first time since Jake had met him, Vextar looked surprised.